The sun over Dry Creek, Texas did not shine, it punished. It pressed down on the cracked, pale earth like a branding iron held too long, splitting the dirt into a mosaic of dead, curling patches that crunched underfoot like old bone. The year was 1873, and Dry Creek was the kind of frontier town that appeared on no proper map, only on the lips of men giving warnings. A single road of packed dust ran through its spine, flanked on both sides by weather-beaten timber buildings that leaned slightly as though tired of standing. The saloon, the feed store, the sheriff's office with its peeling paint and perpetually half-open door. A church at the far end so small and pale it looked like it might blow away before Sunday. The smell of the place was horse sweat, sawdust, and something sour beneath it all, the smell of hard living and harder people. On the third Tuesday of every month, the town gathered at the open lot beside the livery stable. Not for market, not for church, for the labor auction. It was common enough in these parts, nobody pretended otherwise. Orphaned children, runaways, those abandoned at the edges of civilization by circumstance or by people who were supposed to love them, were processed through a crude system and sold to ranchers, saloon owners, and homesteaders as contracted workers. The law squinted at it. The church cleared its throat and looked away. The town simply called it practical. By 10:30, a crowd had gathered in the flat, merciless heat. Ranch bosses stood with their thumbs in their belt loops, squinting beneath wide-brimmed hats darkened with old sweat. A cluster of townswomen lingered near the back, fanning themselves with folded paper, speaking in low tones, not in protest, but in the practiced whisper of those who observe cruelty without intervening in it. Two saloon men leaned against a post, picking their teeth, watching with the casual interest of men browsing cattle. Among them stood Wade Calloway. He was not an easy man to look at, not because he was frightening, but because he looked so thoroughly defeated. 41 years old, though he carried the weight of 60. His face was a landscape of deep lines and sun damage, a jaw rough with several days of gray stubble. His coat was canvas brown and too thin for respectability, patched at both elbows with darker fabric that didn't quite match. His boots, cracked leather, worn clean through at the left heel, told the story of a man walking a long road with no end in sight. He owned 60 acres of scrubland north of town, a small herd of cattle growing thinner by the season, and debts that arrived more reliably than rain. He had $11 in his coat pocket. He had not decided yet what he was going to do with them. The auctioneer, a thick-necked man named Grover Pittock, who wore the same brown vest every auction day, climbed onto the low wooden platform and called the crowd to attention with 2 flat claps of his meaty hands. There were 4 children that morning. 2 boys went quickly, a wiry 10-year-old purchased by a cotton farmer without ceremony, a teenage boy taken by the livery owner before bidding even properly opened. A young girl of perhaps 9 was bought by a ranch wife, who at least looked at her with something resembling consideration. Then came Lot 9. She was brought forward by Pittock's assistant, a tall, narrow man who held her by the upper arm the way one carries something they don't want to touch. She was 12 years old, though she looked younger, hollow-cheeked, collarbone visible above the torn neckline of a dress that had once been yellow but was now the color of river mud. Her feet were bare and calloused. Her dark hair had been roughly cut, likely to manage lice, leaving it uneven and ragged above her ears. She did not cry. She stood on the platform with her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the crowd, somewhere far and unreachable. And she did not flinch, did not tremble, did not give those watching the satisfaction of visible fear. She had already learned, in whatever short and brutal life had brought her here, that showing fear cost more than hiding it. The crowd stirred, but not with sympathy. "Small," said one man near the front, arms crossed. "Won't last a season in the field." "Plenty of kitchen work in a small one," said another, and the 2 men beside him chuckled with the specific carelessness of those who have never considered that the subject of their amusement can hear every word. Pittock started the bidding at $6. Numbers were called. Lazy, unhurried. This was not a prize lot, and the crowd knew it. The saloon man bid $7, then lost interest. A rancher from the eastern edge of the county raised to 8 and then shrugged and stepped back. Wade Calloway stood very still. He was not a man who acted on impulse. He was not a man who had earned the luxury of impulse. But he watched that girl stand on that platform, barefoot, wordless, eyes fixed on a horizon only she could see, and something in his chest moved. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet shift, like a door long closed, opening one careful inch. 11, he said. His voice was low, rough from disuse, but it carried. Pittock looked at him with mild surprise. A few heads turned. Nobody raised higher. $11 for Lot 9 was more than she was expected to fetch, and the serious bidders had already spent their interest. Sold, said Pittock to Calloway. The crowd barely reacted. Men turned back to their conversations. The saloon men pushed off the post and walked toward a drink. The townswomen folded their papers and drifted. Only the sheriff watched Wade a moment longer than necessary, dark-eyed, calculating, before turning away without a word. Wade stepped forward, signed the paper. Pittock's assistant thrust at him and turned toward the girl. She was already watching him. He did not smile. He did not reach for her arm the way the assistant had. He simply turned and walked toward the wagon and said, quietly over his shoulder, "You can ride up front." She followed, not because she trusted him, because she had no other direction left to walk. The wagon rolled north out of Dry Creek without ceremony. No one watched them leave. No one called after them. The town simply absorbed their departure the way dry earth absorbs a sparse rain, without acknowledgement, without record. The timber buildings shrank behind them, then disappeared altogether behind a low rise of scrubland, and soon there was nothing in any direction but open country, pale grass, scattered mesquite, the occasional dark silhouette of a vulture riding a thermal high overhead. Wade held the reins loosely in both hands and said nothing. The girl sat on the far right edge of the bench, as far from him as the width of the wagon allowed, with her bare feet flat on the floorboard and her hands folded tightly in her lap. Every stone the wheels rolled over, every unexpected lurch of the wagon on the uneven trail made her shoulders rise slightly toward her ears. A flinch she had trained herself to make small, but could not yet eliminate entirely. Her eyes moved constantly, scanning the brush on both sides of the trail with the specific vigilance of someone who had learned that danger rarely announces itself. Wade noticed. He said nothing about it. He did not explain himself, did not offer reassurances she had no reason yet to believe. He understood, in the wordless way of a man who had witnessed enough suffering to recognize its posture, that words right now were worth less than silence. That patience was the only currency she might eventually accept. The ride was 40 minutes. They passed through a dry creek bed, the real one, not the town, where the wagon wheels dropped and climbed with a hard knock, and a jackrabbit burst from beneath a brittle salt bush and vanished into the scrub. The girl watched it go. For just a moment, the vigilance in her face softened into something younger, something that still remembered, somewhere beneath everything that had happened to it, what it was to be curious. Then it was gone again. Wade's ranch appeared without grandeur. A modest cabin of rough-hewn timber, darkened by years of weather, sitting low against the earth as though it had grown from it rather than been built upon it. A stone chimney. One window facing south, its glass thick and slightly warped. A covered porch just wide enough for a single chair, which sat there with the stillness of something that had not been moved in a long time. Beside the cabin, a small barn leaning gently eastward, its doors propped open with a flat rock. A fence of cedar posts and rusted wire ran in an imperfect line around a modest pasture where 7 cattle stood in the thin shade of a lone post oak, tails switching at flies. It was not prosperous, but it was in some quality difficult to name immediately decent. Wade climbed down from the wagon without rushing and looped the reins over the post by the porch. He did not help the girl down, did not reach for her, and she dropped from the bench to the ground herself, landing barefoot in the pale dust, and stood still, reading the place the way she had learned to read every new place, measuring its dangers, locating its exits, Wade pushed open the cabin door and left it open behind him. She stood outside for a long moment. Then she stepped onto the porch. Then, slowly, across the threshold. The inside of the cabin was one room, spare and orderly. A cast iron stove against the near wall, cold now, but clean. A table of rough pine with 2 chairs. A shelf above the table holding 3 items, a tin coffee cup, a small cloth sack of tobacco, and a Bible, its cover dark with handling, its spine cracked from repeated opening. On the opposite wall, a wooden bunk with a thin mattress and a folded wool blanket. And on a higher shelf, set apart from everything else with the careful placement of something precious, a small corn husk doll, dressed in a tiny scrap of faded calico, its yarn hair coming slightly loose at one side. The girl looked at the doll for a moment longer than anything else. Wade had moved to a wooden trunk near the stove. He opened it and lifted out a folded dress, small, worn soft with washing, pale blue with white stitching at the collar. He set it on the table without comment. From the stove shelf, he took a covered pot, spooned cold beans into a tin bowl, and placed it beside the dress with a spoon and a torn piece of cornbread. "Outhouse is behind the barn," he said. "Water barrels on the east side. Soap's on the ledge above it." He picked up his hat from the table, walked back to the door, and paused. "I'll be fixing fence till dusk. You don't have to do anything today." Then he walked out onto the porch, settled into his chair, and was quiet. The girl stood alone in the center of the cabin. She looked at the dress, at the food, at the doll on its shelf, at the open door through which the late afternoon light came in long and golden, carrying the smell of dust and dry grass. She sat down at the table. She ate, slowly at first, the measured, careful eating of someone who has learned not to trust that the bowl won't be taken away. And then when nothing happened, when no one came through the door, when the only sound was the distant knock of Wade's hammer against cedar post and the low breathing of wind through the mesquite, she ate like a child. She did not cry. She simply ate, and outside the warped south window, the Texas sun began its slow descent toward the flat edge of the world, pulling long shadows across the cracked earth like dark blankets drawn gently over the land. Inside, the corn husk doll watched from its shelf. It had once belonged to a girl who did not survive her 7th winter. Wade had never moved it. Wade was up before the sun. He stood at the cold stove in the gray, pre-dawn stillness, boiling water for coffee, listening to the quiet of the cabin behind him. The girl was asleep on the bunk. He had taken the floor without remark, rolling out his bedroll beside the stove as though it were the most natural arrangement in the world. She had watched him do it with suspicious eyes until exhaustion finally overcame suspicion sometime past midnight. He drank his coffee on the porch in the dark. By the time the horizon began to pale, he had already made his decision. He saddled his horse, a broad, patient roan mare named Dust, the one reliable thing left on the property, and rode south toward Dry Creek before the girl woke. He did not leave a note. He could not be certain she could read one, but he left the cabin door unlatched, the beans warm on the stove, and the blue dress folded on the table, where she could find it. He rode hard. The trail back to town was empty at that hour, the scrubland silver and cool in the early light, jackrabbits freezing in the brush as Dust's hooves beat past. Wade rode with his jaw set and his eyes forward, and the particular expression of a man who has thought something through completely and arrived at the far side of doubt. Dry Creek was just waking when he arrived. A boy was sweeping the saloon steps. Smoke was beginning to rise from the chimney of the cookhouse. The sheriff's horse stood already saddled at the post outside the jail, which meant Harlan Poe, the town's land judge and auction authority, would be in his office. Poe arrived early on days when he had business to conduct. On all other days, he arrived late and left early and conducted himself with the slow, entitled ease of a man who has never been seriously inconvenienced. Wade tied Dust at the post and went inside without knocking. Judge Harlan Poe was a wide man, wide in the shoulders, wide in the middle, wide in the face, with a gray mustache that he groomed with more attention than he gave most legal matters. He sat behind a desk covered in papers he rarely read, holding a tin cup of coffee, and he looked up at Wade's entrance with the mild irritation of a man interrupted during the only peaceful part of his day. "Calloway," he said, "not a greeting, just an identification." Wade placed a folded piece of paper on the desk. Poe did not touch it. "What's this?" "Freedom document," Wade said, "for the girl I purchased yesterday at auction. I'm applying for legal guardianship under Frontier provision. I need your signature as presiding judge." Poe looked at the paper, then at Wade. Then he leaned back in his chair and laughed, a short, flat sound like a hand slapping wood. "You spent $11 yesterday," Poe said. "Now you want to give away what you paid for?" "I want to make it legal," Wade said. "What I paid for was a piece of paper. I'm asking you to replace it with a better one." Poe's amusement cooled slightly. He studied Wade with the calculating look of a man trying to determine whether the person in front of him is principled or simply foolish. With broke ranchers, it was usually the latter. "I won't sign that," Poe said flatly. "Child labor contracts are legal and registered. You disrupt the auction system, you disrupt commerce. I won't have it." Wade looked at him for a long, steady moment. "All right," he said. He picked up the paper, folded it, and walked out. Poe watched him go with the satisfied expression of a man who has ended a conversation. He had not ended it. Wade walked directly to the whitewashed church at the far end of the road, where Reverend Silas Stubbs was turning the soil in his small side garden with a short-handled spade. Stubbs was a lean, quiet man in his 60s, with pale eyes that had seen enough frontier suffering to have lost their innocence but not their conscience. Wade explained what he needed in under 2 minutes. Stubbs wiped his hands on his trousers, read the document carefully, and signed it without hesitation. Then he looked at Wade with those pale eyes and said, "You want witnesses?" "I want it posted," Wade said. Together, they walked to the center of town. Wade unfolded the document and pinned it to the public notice board, the wide, weathered board outside the general store where wanted posters, land notices, and auction results were nailed in overlapping layers. He drove the nail himself, with a rock he picked up from the ground, 3 firm strikes. Then he stepped back. A ranch hand, reading the board beside them, went still. A woman coming out of the general store slowed, then stopped. The boy who had been sweeping the saloon steps drifted closer, broom still in hand, reading slowly with moving lips. The document was plain and without elegance. It stated, in Wade's rough handwriting, that the girl known as Lot 9 of the Dry Creek Labor Auction, date of March 11, 1873, was hereby a free person, not subject to contracted labor, placed under the voluntary legal guardianship of Wade Calloway of North County, witnessed and co-signed by Reverend Silas Stubbs. Word moved through Dry Creek the way fire moves through dry grass. By the time Wade untied dust from the post and turned her north, people had gathered at the notice board in ones and twos, reading, murmuring, some outraged, some silent with an expression that might, under different conditions, have been called shame. The sheriff stood on his steps and watched Wade ride out of town. He did not stop him. Wade rode back toward the ranch at an even pace, the afternoon light coming in long and warm from the west, the document copy folded square in his breast pocket, pressed against his chest, close to where, for the first time in a long while, something had restarted. Wade returned to the ranch an hour before sundown. He unsaddled Dust without hurry, rubbed her down with a dry cloth, gave her a measure of oats from a near-empty barrel, and turned her into the pasture. The cattle stood in their usual cluster beneath the post oak, unbothered. The wind had dropped to almost nothing. The whole property sat in the particular stillness of late afternoon, that brief, golden pause when the day has finished its harshness and not yet surrendered to dark. He walked to the cabin. The girl was on the porch. She had found the blue dress. It was slightly large for her, the hem touching her ankles, the sleeves rolled twice at the wrist, but she had smoothed it carefully and sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching him cross the yard with those same measuring eyes. Watchful, waiting. Wade stepped onto the porch, reached past her without crowding her, and opened the cabin door. He went inside and returned with the folded document copy. He crossed to the interior wall beside the bunk and pressed it flat against the timber, and with 2 small nails from his coat pocket and the handle of his knife, he fixed it there, level, deliberate, permanent. He stepped back and looked at it for a moment. Then he turned and looked at the girl, who had come to stand in the doorway, watching. "That's yours," he said. "Says you're free. Says nobody can sell you or contract you or put you on a platform again. Says you live here, under my name, protected by what law this county has, which ain't much, but it's something." He pulled out his chair and sat down at the table. "You don't owe me a day's work," he said, looking at the table rather than at her, giving her the space of not being watched while she absorbed it. "You don't owe me conversation. You don't owe me nothing, but you're safe here if you want to be." The girl stood in the doorway for a long time. The sun was very low now, pressing the cabin's shadow long and thin across the pale yard. Somewhere out in the scrub, a meadowlark called once cleanly and was silent. She came inside. She did not speak that evening, but she sat at the table while Wade cooked salt pork and cornmeal, plain and without apology, and she ate at the table beside him instead of turning away. When he opened the Bible after supper and read aloud by lamplight, his thick finger moving slowly beneath the words, she watched his finger without expression. When he closed it and set it on the shelf beside the tobacco tin, she reached out and touched the cover briefly with 2 fingers, the way a person touches something they're considering trusting. Wade saw it, said nothing. The days that followed arrived quietly. She began to wake before him and have the stove fire started by the time he rose, not because he asked, but because purpose, even small purpose, was something she was rebuilding in herself one careful morning at a time. She fed the chickens with the focused efficiency of someone who needed tasks to feel solid. She watched Wade mend fence from a distance, then closer, then beside him, handing him staples from the tin pail without being asked. He accepted them without comment, without praise excessive enough to embarrass her. He taught her to read from the Bible, the only book the cabin held. They sat together in the evenings at the table, the lamp between them, his rough voice sounding out the words first, then waiting while she tried them. She was quicker than he expected, though he did not say so in a way that would make her self-conscious. He simply moved to harder words sooner, and she followed without stumbling. 3 weeks after the auction, on a still evening when the sky above the scrubland had gone the deep amber and violet of a healing bruise, they sat together on the porch, Wade in his chair, the girl on the edge of the planking with her feet dangling above the dust. The cattle were grazing. Dust stood at the fence line, ears forward, watching something in the far brush. The girl spoke, not loudly, barely above the sound of the wind moving through the mesquite. "I want a name," she said. Wade looked at her from the side without turning his head fully, giving her the privacy of being mostly unobserved. "All right," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the pasture. "Wren," she said, "like the bird that always comes back to the same branch, no matter what." Wade was still for a long moment. The meadowlark in the scrub called again, as if in quiet agreement with the evening. "Wren," he repeated, not questioning it, confirming it, setting it. He stood, went inside, and came back with his knife. He crouched beside the open cabin door and carved the name into the timber frame, just above the height of a child's head, 6 careful letters, straight and deep enough to outlast the weather. W-R-E-N. He folded his knife, stood, and returned to his chair. Wren looked at the carved letters for a long time, her bare feet swinging gently above the pale dust of the yard. Neither of them spoke again that evening. They did not need to. The sun went down slow and enormous over West Texas, pulling its great orange light across the scrubland in long, final ribbons until the sky darkened to purple, then to the deep and quiet blue of a world settling into rest. On the porch of a struggling ranch, north of a town that had expected the worst of a broken man, a child sat beside her name carved in wood. And for the first time in a life too short and too hard, she did not watch the dark for what might come out of it. She simply watched the stars come out, one by one, steady, unhurried, each one arriving and staying. The town had expected a rancher to break a child. Instead, a child would slowly put a broken man back together.